Marcia Dinkins, Executive Director and Lead for the Black Appalachian Coalition. With the financial support of the Heinz Foundation and High Tides Foundation, BLAC was launched on June 18th, 2021, for the purpose of decolonizing the romanticized narrative about Appalachia and rural regions. It was also launched to center Black voices using story-based strategies to decolonize not only the narrative, but imagery and history of Appalachia. To create a platform for Black voices across the regions through listening sessions, and to bring forth results from those sessions through Black papers and other creative forms to address Black erasure, Black invisibility, and Black divestment, while shifting the dynamics for meaningful and collective policymaking that centers, prioritizes, and brings in Black voices and their lived experiences. Over the last several months, BLAC held 4 listening sessions in each region. That's Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, and ended with the story of us, which brought together all of the voices for the region. The BLAC paper is a culmination of Black voices in Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The BLAC paper speaks to the richness and history of Black people in Appalachia, the erasure of those voices, the continual divestments of Black Appalachians, and the need for not only infrastructure and human infrastructure, but a collective healing through stories to decolonize the Appalachian narrative that is rooted in monolithic whiteness, while also speaking to the need and the necessity for media to help break down and dismantle policymaking and how we should show up. What we have learned from these sessions and stories is that across all policy issues, there's a common need and thread for Black storytelling and participation as a precondition for policymaking. Narrative shapes how policymakers prioritize and define public problems. As such, narratives that leave out the Black parts of the region's history and present context guarantee that problems experienced by Black people won't be prioritized, and racist policymaking will continue, which will only exacerbate racist policies connected to the US slave trade, voter suppression, how we're depicted in media, Black erasure, racial pain, economic and environmental divestment, just to name a few. Policymakers must place value on creating spaces for Black Appalachians that have been historically oppressed and ignored to share their stories, and shift narratives to accurately reflect the region's past and present history that includes the rich contributions of Black Appalachians. Black Appalachian roots run deep, and if we are to have good policymaking, the roots connected to Black voices, Black stories, Black pain, the lived experience of Black Appalachian, and the true history of Black people must be a priority in dismantling degenerative policymaking. I am so excited to have today with us Shana Goggins, who is a community organizer with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, Crystal Good, the founder and author of Black by God, and Melanie Mead, a long-term activist in Clairton, Pennsylvania. Each of our speakers will speak to the necessity of storytelling and policy making and the need for Black voices to be at the table. So without further ado, I'd like to get started. Shana, welcome, and thank you for being a part of this rich conversation and the launch of the first Black Appalachian issue paper.
Absolutely, it's my privilege and honor to be here.
So Shana, understanding, over the past several months and the conversations that we've had, what I'd like for you to do is really to speak to the history and the long horizon of Black people in the Appalachian region, looking at identity politics and what does that mean, for, as you stated in the paper, what does that mean for shifting the narrative into the framework of policy making to address Black erasure that continues to keep people out of the story? What is the identity, or how do Black people see themselves in Appalachia, and how does this contribute to Black erasure?
That's a really excellent question, and it's a very personal question for me, in that the community that I was born and raised in is a geographically and ARC defined Appalachian community. But for a significant period of my life, I never viewed myself as an Appalachian. I shared before, in one of our previous sessions, If you go to that community today and you ask my grandmother, my mother's mother, if she's an Appalachian, she will tell you no, flat out, just based on what her understanding is and her perception, and then also the stereotypes. So the long and the short of it is, we have never necessarily been viewed as characters in the Appalachian story. I taught a course in Introduction to Appalachian Studies at a majority white institution of higher education. And I love to talk. I love to talk about Appalachia. Once I figured out I was Appalachian and I could actually embrace and carry that identity to its fullest capacity, I will talk your leg off about anything that relates to Appalachia. So the class was a perfect platform for me. And even with my life experience and the various positions that I've held, I was intimidated because in the beginning, I felt like I was going into a space and I was going to be talking to people about something that was not mine. So again, I had to check myself on that, in that I am a character in this story. These places, these issues, these concerns, they are mine. They may be different than the majority of individuals that we identify as Appalachians in terms of race or ethnicity. They're still my story. So I think we, as Black Appalachians, one, we have to embrace and accept that this is our story. But then also with that comes the stigma of being labeled Appalachian, because a lot of people still believe we are uneducated and barefoot. Now, look, there's something to be said about not wearing shoes and how it grounds you and connects you to the land. But that's a story for a different time, right? But the perception is that we're uneducated and we are at a disadvantage. And Black people as a whole, we already get that just based on being Black. And then when you couple cultural and or geographical identities with that, that's an additional burden that we want to bury. So we as a group, we have to embrace that this is us. This is a group that we belong to. And being part of that group and embracing that identity gives us power, because we are not just Black Americans living in a geographic region and not being impacted by the things that are going on in that geographic region. Homelessness impacts Black Americans and it impacts Black Appalachian Americans as well. But as in life, those things are multifaceted and there's many different layers. So for us, going back to, as far as incorporating the historical context, again, it's an understanding that this is your story, you are a character in this story. And then figuring out what messages you might have received that told you this was not your story and that you should not be concerned about these issues or disparities in the same way as white Appalachians. One of the things that you listed within our agenda is we talk about from the coal mines of Atlanta to the coal mines of West Virginia. And again, when you think about the story of Appalachia and you think about the images of Appalachia, you don't really see Black coal miners in a lot of those images. And then you also understand to a degree that what happened within the coal community was a thing that impacted white Appalachians and not Black Appalachians. But that again, that's a misconception, that's a misnomer. Each of us in some way have been impacted, whether there was a person in our family that worked within the coal industry or we lived in a community in which the coal industry dominated that. We have to get comfortable with having uncomfortable and difficult conversations. Many of the stories that my grandparents shared with me was about themselves and their adventures, if you will, of growing up in an Appalachian community during Jim Crow and segregation at the turn and then through the civil rights movement, all the way up to two of my grandmothers being able to experience having a president that looked like them. That's a vast amount of history that's covered in that span, right? But one of the things that they never really did was talk about how their experiences were significant to the story of Appalachia, because they had also been told they're not the characters in this story. This is not their story. That we, as Black Appalachians, we have a totally separate story. We are in a position as it stands right now to be able to merge those stories. And I know a lot of people are concerned about merging the stories and that our unique identity and our unique experience is not lost. But I would offer it's being lost anyway, in that we don't know the history. We don't know the significance of our contributions to Appalachia. We don't have representation at the table when these policy conversations are being made. Everyone likes to say that history repeats itself. I had a professor once that told me that in life, the universe will present you with challenges and lessons. And if you learn what you need to learn, you will not see that challenge nor lesson presented again. And in so many ways, we see those same challenges and lessons being presented. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we learning from history? Are we taking advantage of the opportunity that we have now to interject our voice into this narrative and to share the richness that embodies what our chapter of the Appalachian story is? If not, it is a disservice to ourselves, and it is a disservice to our ancestors that did not have the ability to be able to claim that, or to embrace the aspects of Appalachianness that make us so beautiful. Again, it's all about, think about it from the standpoint of right now, many communities in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and probably across the United States, their government and elected officials are having conversations about how to utilize the American Rescue Plan dollars. Now, we would hope that decisions are being made about the use of these funds that we may never, ever, ever see again in the course of our lifetime, and how they can do good, as in addressing issues or disparities within communities. Now, they have their criteria, obviously, and that's fine. But what conversations are happening, and to what degree is equity and inclusion being considered? When we're talking about infrastructure, are we talking about the infrastructure in communities of people of color? Or are we just talking about the infrastructure in terms of some areas may have pet projects that they want to execute that have nothing to do with improving the overall quality of life? So in my community, what the city intends to do is to distribute a survey to the citizens to receive input. Now, as a behavior scientist, that absolutely intrigues me, but then also I find it sort of problematic in that in the distribution of the survey to solicit comments, are you making sure that this survey is widely being distributed to communities and neighborhoods or groups of people that are not typically a part of this conversation? Because again, how can we really say that we are representing the best interests of the community when we are still only soliciting those people that are in the know, if you will, or those people who feel that this is their story and not sharing their input and or concerns? So it's all the way from having events like this where people can share their stories or stories that are connected to them personally or professionally. It's also encouraging. I have to just go off for a second and say the presence of Crystal this morning is so timely, because in one of my member or chapters with KFTC, we are having conversations about showing up at city commission meetings. So again, we could not have been put together in a more opportune way. But going to that, that's important, as in people of color live in the communities where people are making decisions, but are people of color involved in those conversations? Have we been told that that's not our place and that's not our right? And it's so refreshing to hear Crystal just in our pre-conversation mention the power of just being present. And many times I think we need to be present in order to see that that is the place that we belong. That is where we are supposed to be. And then hopefully building skills and resources from the people that are there to help us add to this narrative so that we can ensure we don't have a one-sided story. And Bishop, as always, please tell me if I just completely danced around your question and or prompt. Because again, sometimes, get on a tangent about Appalachia. So
No,
wrangle me in if I needed to be wrangled in.
no, you are fine. I really appreciate the fact, when you speak to how the identity of Black people in Appalachia really isn't anything that they embrace, and just really speaking to that, not only in the listening sessions, but bringing that forth inside of the Black paper. But what you also said that really comes to mind is you talked about the similarities and you talked about these differences and these experiences. And so for a moment, not taking away from the Black space, we do need to bring in other voices. And we're doing this because we have to understand the story of Appalachia rests on two sides of the fence, not just one side of the fence. And just really building off of what you said, there are similarities and differences. And then how do we bring those similarities into place? And then how do we build upon those differences, for meaningful policy making? So I'd like to invite Eric Dixon, who is from Kentucky. He is a white person who lives in Appalachia, but to speak to that, because we have to understand that in order to dismantle degenerative policy making, it's not, we have to have Black stories and Black voices in the forefront, and those stories have to be heard. But also, how do we come together, as as Shana mentioned, and the similarities and the differences, and then how do we, as a people in organizations, come together so that we are ensuring that all voices are being held and heard and supported?
Thank you, Bishop Dinkins, and good morning, everybody. My name is Eric Dixon. I'm calling from Louisville today, and I'm a researcher with the Ohio River Valley Institute. And we've been partnering with the Black Appalachian Coalition on the issue brief that Bishop Dinkins has mentioned and that you'll hear more about later in the call. And I just wanted to kind of speak to the questions that were just raised by Bishop Dinkins, and also some thoughts that have come to me in the process of working on this kind of policy-focused paper with the coalition. So I feel like we're in this moment right now in the Appalachian region where it's kind of a new era in the conversation around transition and around a new economy. And I feel like that conversation has been happening for a while now, but it's only kind of growing by the day and being elevated by the day. And I think, that conversation is centered around coal. It's centered around energy. A little further north, I think it's centered around industry and steel making. And all of those things are kind of energy or economic related aspects. And I think they're also rooted in, like, the conversation that we're having is about regional inequality. It's about what's happening in this region versus not happening in the rest of the country or in other regions. And I think in many ways and in many spaces, organizing around that regional identity and that shared regional experience is a powerful thing. And I think we want to organize around that, commonality and larger group that, as we can. But we also know that the experiences of people in the region aren't, they're different. Different people experience Appalachia differently and have different histories in the region. And that isn't reflected, to my eyes, in the way that we're having this conversation about what it means for our region to transition. And I think because of that, we're not seeing a conversation, specifically to to what we're talking about today, around anti-racism or around racial equity when we talk about, building a new economy in Appalachia at least in many of the spaces when we talk about that conversation. So I think in a general sense, like a big thing that we need to do here as, if one way that we're thinking about public policy and public problems in the region is that larger conversation around transition. And if we're using that as kind of a frame and an organizing vehicle, we need to connect that conversation with other conversations that I think we're having, to some extent nationally, and to, I think, a much lesser extent regionally, though it's happening in some places, around race and around anti-racism. And we need to, just in a basic sense, define, that as a problem when we talk about the problems we're trying to solve with public policy and transition, or the new economy that we're trying to build. Or even, some people, talk about it in terms of like the shared prosperity or the bright future we're trying to build in our place. And I think to one thing that Bishop Dinkins said at the beginning, one thing that we're trying to do with this project is model how to work together in some very, small way with this project, in terms of how we can be more in sync in terms of policymaking in bigger ways. And I think the second thing that I want to mention is a way that I'm thinking about it in a more personal way, or related to our organization in particular. So I think, traditionally, and, even now, many think tanks or policy-based organizations are white organizations, and they come from, and I think reflect largely white experiences, white lived experiences. And I think, we're Ohio River Valley Institute, we're a new organization. We're a think tank, we're a very policy and research-based organization. And I think one thing that we're trying to figure out is how do we do policy research and policy making differently, and set new precedents, in our region for how to approach this work. And I think that policy priorities are set in many different ways. But one way that policy priorities are set is through research, and the topics that are chosen for research and chosen for study. And, I think we need to change not only the methodological ways that we're approaching research, but who's part of selecting those research priorities, right? Because that has impacts on how we're prioritizing public problems and the narratives around those public problems. So, again, I think one way that we're thinking about this project is testing out a different way to think about what, research priorities we have as an organization, and how we approach policymaking as a white organization, and as a white researcher myself, around these issues. So that's why we're partnering with the Black Appalachian Coalition. And we've tried to, have these listening sessions very much guide and be the first step in what I don't think we have figured out yet in terms of what the broader policy research agenda will be in the future. But I think we want it to guide that. And that's one reason we're having this conversation today, is I think to continue to try to figure that out. And I think part of that is also we see, we obviously see racial equity and racial or anti-racism work as important in the policy work that we're doing. And, it's going to take, I think, someone said at the beginning of the call, it's going to take all of us to achieve those objectives, all of us. And so, we see it as part of our responsibility or our role in, carrying some of the workload of that research around what do these issues around, the history of displacement, Black displacement in the region, or contemporary stuff around, incarceration or disenfranchisement. What does that look like in particular in our place? We see ourselves as, having a role in that research, and the workload around those issues. Yeah, so that's just kind of some of my thoughts. I'll stop there and pass it back to you, Bishop Dinkin.
Thank you, Eric, for sharing. So basically, the question is what we're really bringing home here in the comparison or just the conversation between Shana and Eric is really the reality of is that while we know the problem and we address the problem, not only in the listening sessions, but in the policy paper, and what do we do to shift that, but just raising the voice and the need that, yes, Black people are in the forefront of the work of the Black Appalachian Coalition, but we also understand that there are some spaces where we have to come together as a whole. We can talk about race, but we can't, and we can talk about racism, but racism will never be diminished if only Black people are talking about racism. It is going to take all of us, levels of accountability, levels of truth, levels of looking at how policy making since the beginning of policy making has always been a lever to keep a certain group of people out. And when we look at the narrative around Appalachia and how that narrative has basically colonized Black people, how this narrative continues to, when you ask somebody about rural or Appalachia, the first thing that they think about is this romanticized, as I often say, a nostalgic this place that's rooted in whiteness, as though Appalachia is a monolith, when it isn't. It is a culture of beautiful people of diverse backgrounds. But yet we still see, as Eric has mentioned, in research and policy making and conversation and narrative, analyzing and problem defining in policy making, that Black voices are still not there, that Black people are still not heard, that Black erasure is still perpetuated. And as a result of the US, slave trade policies, we continue to see these things moving forward. So one thing that I can say, while the Black Appalachian Coalition is all about, our priority is centering the voices of Black people, centering the voices of lived experiences, while also creating this policy framework that addresses the decolonization of the narrative and degenerative policy making. We also understand that, again, as I said before, it's going to take all of us, not just some of us. If we're going to break the lines of isolation in policy making, we have to learn to come together in our similarities and figure out in conversations what our differences are. And then how do we coalesce this together with the respect, as I always say, of stepping up, stepping back, stepping away, stepping aside. There always has to be this dance of who goes in front first. So I thank you, Eric and Shana, for sharing that. I'd like to move on to you, Melanie, because one of the things that's mentioned in the paper is how you speak to so powerfully that in order to decolonize the narrative around Appalachia or Black erasure, is we not only have to look at infrastructure and not only human infrastructure, because we know that we need access to childcare, we need access to healthcare, we need access to quality air, we need access to good water. But you also speak so powerfully about, in order to get all of these things, we also need access to healing. So I'd like to just give space for you to speak to that more broadly, and how, as you have mentioned earlier, how this continues to really diminish the voices of Black people in policymaking, but also how, in telling these stories, it is elevating the need and the necessity for Black voices in storytelling for policy. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied, for policymaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop, for having me here and giving me an opportunity to speak. I think that Shana and Eric have brought up a lot of good points, especially when it comes to identity and identifying who we are, where we are, and in our stories. And when you take away a person's place of value in their story, generally they don't have any identity. And so what I find important for us to do in these areas where communities are being pushed out, their voices are being ignored, and their identity unrooted, I feel like it's important for us to go back to why we needed to run barefoot, as Shana had mentioned, and the fact that that is a form of grounding and connection to where you are and who you are. As slaves, we had to restore, revitalize, and maintain ourselves to move forward. There was never a thought to give up and quit for those who were pushing forward. So if we were to really go back to our history, we would find those who were of help to us, those who shared what they knew about the lands and the terrain and what helped them to maintain and sustain through the indigenous populations who were here already. And we had relations and connections that allowed for us to heal. That doesn't exist now. When you look at like in Kentucky and in this region here in Pennsylvania, many of the people are on go times 50. They haven't created anything that allows them to have ritual and balance with where they are. It's a place we call home because it's home, but we don't look about what can home provide for us. Much of our food is being transported in 18-wheelers. So we don't have gardens. We don't have the elders to say, this is a time and season for pruning. This is a time and season for harvest. And in order for us to know and connect with and collaborate with the right-minded people, we have to have a right mind within ourselves. We have to be whole and complete so that we don't necessarily sell out our position at the table. And I think that that is what has happened through the years. And that's why we've lacked the progress that, you know, we aren't where we can be. But thankfully enough, we are in a place now where we can take action and connect with the right people who want to collaborate and give us a space to tell our stories and not tell the story for us or from their perspective. I think that this also is an opportune time to engage our youth because they need to hear the stories told of our survival and resilience in the little ways of gardening and being able to eat food that we were able to produce and know how healthy it was, opposed to not knowing where your food is coming from and whether it's of any great benefit to you. So when it comes to policy making, I think that our history and how we've maintained and sustained through all that we've endured here is vital, not just as what some may say as a way of creating victim identity, but I think that it's vital in understanding what actions can be taken to move forward beyond the place of victimhood, and then empowering to create new communities and new policies that change moving forward how things operate. That's what we have the opportunity to do here now. And I'm so very thankful to be around like minds and getting the voices that need to be heard. In my area, many of the parents of the children who suffer from asthma, which is twice the national average, won't speak up because they feel that they may not be able to get employed in the region. And I think that that's something that we thought existed. I didn't think that would still exist. And because we haven't been Appalachian to tell the story, we forget that those are our experiences too. And until we restore who we are and re-identify with our place, we won't be able to make the right policy. So I think it's in our best effort to get established. And I think that what you are doing here, Bishop Marcia, with BLAC is the most opportune thing in a vital time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Melanie. I'd like to move to our next guest, Crystal Good from Black by God. But I do want to say this, and what I find, powerful in what Crystal is going to address with regards to policymaking, media, and storytelling is that it's breaking down assumptions, breaking down the assumptions that policy organizations need to be white only, that researching needs to be white only. The whole preface around Black is to say that those spaces don't have to be white only, and that we have to bring in Black voices, we have to bring in Black people in order for participatory policy making to take place. Historically, has all of the organizations been white, white-led organizations around policy? Yes. Is there a lot of Black policymakers? We have Black people who are in policy, but we also have to be honest with ourselves and speak to the absence of how many Black voices or how many voices are brought into policy making, especially when we talk about the methodology. We're talking about shifting the way people think with regards to methodology in policy making, in research, in organizing, in data-driven campaigns, and how we even speak to and advance policy, because a lot of times what we see is more or less, and let me just get a little, I'll speak school language for a moment. We look at it from the positivist view, that it's data only, it's all quantitative, not qualitative. And so what Black is doing is saying, no, we need to move beyond this quantitative lens into a more transformative lens that's speaking to the fact that we need to have the lived experiences and the lived stories of Black people in these spaces so that we are redefining policy and policy problems that bring us in. We are also looking at the fact that in order for this to take place, not only is it the lived experience, but it's transpersonal. How do we personally, begin to transcend how policy making is done if it is absent of the stories of Black people, the lives of Black people, the pain of Black people, and does not address the healing of Black people? So what I, like to say is that in this space, what I can appreciate about each and every voice here and leading into Crystal is the fact that we are understanding, we are also bringing forth the fact that we have to be in these spaces so that those assumptions that everything has to be a white only thing in order for things to get done, where we have to operate or receive the savior mentality that is brought into our communities, because if it's not done by white, it's not done right. And what we're saying is, no, we're breaking those assumptions that's connected to the colonization of the narrative. So Crystal, I'd like to make space for you to speak more broadly to that, because as you said earlier, we have to be present in those spaces in so many different ways, because it's not just policy making that is also perpetuating, the degenerative policies and helping to continue this narrative, but it's also media and the absence of us in all of those spaces. So I'd like to open up, the floor and for you to just really build upon that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. And my heart is full right now. I just got to express that. My heart is full right now. And I saw a comment over there that Betty Rivard is listening. And Betty Rivard in West Virginia, I consider her one of the coolest girls at Capitol High. Now, I call the Gold Dome in West Virginia Capitol High School, because listen, everything that you learned in high school is all you need to go to your local legislature. Okay. So listen, let me tell you, they got the coal club in West Virginia, right? They got the, the natural gas club in West Virginia. They got the environmental club. So basically all of your social skills are applicable at your local legislature. And I'm not joking. All right. Listen, it is people inside those buildings, right? And it is a lot of people, for the most part, asking other people what's really going on is what I figured out as a witness, right? And I say that because let's just get real. Policy is complex. Nobody has all the answers. Even the greatest minds, your legislators, right? Not calling them the greatest minds, but your legislator is dependent on somebody else to help them understand the process and inform the policy. And guess who part of those people are? It's you. That's why when I've been at the Capitol at West Virginia, and I served as a lobbyist in West Virginia for 5 years, and I'd like to kind of share my little bit of my entry into that. I was a fish out of water. I had no idea what I was doing. I'm going to share my screen here because I'm going to post this up on Black by God a little bit later today, which I hope you guys will go visit. But this is a story that I wrote last year. And can you guys see my screen okay? This is a story that I wrote last year, right? And it's called Young, Gifted, and Black in Policy. Because when I was at the West Virginia legislature, and I love this line, sometimes you do love something you write. You know what I mean? You just do love it. It says, I walked the thick, white marble hallways of the West Virginia Capitol as a lobbyist. I taught myself the craft after being frustrated and not knowing about policy during the West Virginia water crisis of 2014 and the subsequent above ground storage tank bill. The process was foreign to me, but what I learned there was that with a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of gumption and to start asking questions, I started to teach myself policy. And now what happened last year, and this is why I'm so excited in this conversation, because I feel it, right? I feel it. In West Virginia, there's a little small town called Rand, West Virginia, right? Rand, West Virginia is home to a famous football player called Randy Moss, which a lot of people have heard of, right? Rand is probably about 12 streets, but Randy is not the only NFL Super Bowl professional athlete. There's 5 others, the same class from 12 streets in West Virginia, right? I don't know what's in the water in West Virginia, what happened during that time, but something special, all right? And that same something special, right, of West Virginians and Appalachians launching themselves into the world as the excellence, right? I feel that in policy in Appalachia, especially in West Virginia. So this article last year that I wrote was sort of explaining how I got into policy and how I didn't know what I was doing, but I just kept showing up. And then guess what? I got my first law passed, right? And I started figuring things out. But the thing that I figured out the most is, where's the Black people? Black people show up on maybe one day when it's like Delta Day or, you know, AKA Day. But where's the Black people? We're not there. And I wanted to start to think about, instead of like saying, why are we not there? And I think a lot of it has to do with just what I've heard in this conversation, is that I think we've created barriers to participation when the first entry in our minds, our first entry to participation is just to show up and to be a witness. Now, listen, I know that I might not have been able to actually influence any policy change, but I know when I showed up to the committee meeting, they were like, who is she and why is she here? Right? With my little notebook, with my little tweeting, right? Power. But now look, folks, I want you to see last year with Dr. Shaniqua Smith, who runs Black Voters Initiative in West Virginia. She was just awarded a fantastic grant from Joe Kennedy. She's going to do great things, right? In engaging citizens. Dr. Shaniqua Smith, you got to follow her, find her. We organized an event last year, and guess what we showcased? Young, Black, and gifted people in policy in West Virginia. I cried, right? Look at these people. Shakira, Raina, Rhonda, Quentin, right? Maya, right? Dijon, right? And I've got one listening today, Malik Smith. If you guys, let me tell you about Malik. You got to go read his op-ed on Black by God, right? It's another young Black policymaker. And I share the story of Rand, West Virginia, because this is it. I am excited. I feel it. I know that young Black policymakers, and young could be 75 to me, are going to shake up the narrative. And that's what we want, right? And so I think this is important that we see each other, which is what we're doing here, right? So I said a lot because I'm super excited, because I want to tell you what I've got going on. And I want to tell you how I think that we can help each other. So I published Black by God, right? You can read it online, and 5,000 of these copies were just distributed. This I call it fine folk reporting. It is fine folk reporting in here, because we have stories that are not only sort of historical context about the power of the Black press, how that influenced policy, but we have op-eds by young people like Malik Smith, who's a canvasser, who's giving a very detailed account of his witness of Senator Shelley Moore Capito's lack of support for the Freedom to Vote Act and absolute sabotage. You won't find that in your local paper. It's an important part of the documentation of the history, which is what the Black press has always done. You go pick an event and you read what the mainstream press wrote, and then you go look and see what the Black press wrote, and you will find two different accounts. That's very important because we've heard a lot about our narrative not being told. We've heard a lot about ourselves not being seen or connected. So with Black by God, it is a place for everyday citizens to share not only their political opinions and voices, but their witness. And that is what is so important to me. It is that we show up at community meetings. And when I say community meetings, I mean your local school board meeting. We've been talking about ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan. And in every ARPA meeting, honey, I don't really even understand ARPA fully. I just know that it's an unprecedented amount of money. That's all I keep hearing, unprecedented amount of money. And I know that what we're going to do is like do some roads, right? We're going to pave Appalachia with ARPA funds, and we're going to do some other things. But I also hear this thing that, oh, it's open to community. But just like Melanie was saying, right? Like, what does this mean? Who is actually getting the survey and being able to contribute? We are at an information deficit, right? What Black by God and why I'm so excited to be connected with this organization, Black, because we have got to build the information highway across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Appalachia, right? And that information highway is how do we distribute information that we need to know, right? And information that makes us feel good, you know, that allows us to see ourselves. And one of the most important places is right here, policy. It's a very entry level way to start to frame and talk about what's going on. And that's why I call it folk reporting, because we just got to keep it real with each other. We don't have to use the language of the quote unquote oppressor, right? We can use our own language to broker information to each other. Like, I'm just going to shoot it straight to you all. The issues that I'm very concerned about in West Virginia is one that we all should be concerned about across Appalachia, and that is the extreme suspension and expulsion rate of Black children and poor white children. All right? If you are a poor white child and you get sent to the principal's office, chances are you're going to get suspended. If you're a Black child, doesn't matter what your income level, if you get sent to the principal's office, chances are you're going to get suspended. Then there's all these other rules according to each state and county around how parents are held accountable. But this is a serious, serious policy issue that I think branches across Appalachia, right? And it impacts. This is one of these examples where when a Black policy group such as us come together, right? And we look at the data and we start, you know, saying this is ridiculous. We cannot have these extreme suspension and expulsion rates, right? And then we empower our local citizens, right, to show up at the committee meeting, to take notes, or just to be there. And we figure out what would make Miss Susie or Mr. Jones a little bit more comfortable to go in there, right? Maybe they need to say, you know what, I'm a reporter with Black by God, I'm here. Maybe they just need to know where to park. Maybe they just need to know that I'm on the other line if they need to text me or call me because they've actually never been to a school board meeting before, right? So we have to kind of think about what these barriers are, because I can tell you a lot of the barriers that the white organizations that I worked with thought that I had, that was not the problem. The problem was I hated being alone at that Capitol, physically alone. And people would say, but you're not alone, you're at the table. I'm like, but I'm alone. I'm alone in this space. And I don't want anybody to ever feel like that. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is a result of my own experiences in trying to navigate policy for myself and show up. And I want to take away a lot of those barriers. And that's why I think what I'm calling folk reporting is really, for me, a huge, huge solution, right? We empower people as citizen journalists to enter into community meetings, take notes, take a picture, Write an article if you want to, will help, however that's structured. We've got to get people in there as witness, right? Because you do change the room when you show up. And a lot of things that happen in our local city council meetings happen every day. Big policy is happening, and we're not, I don't want to say we're not paying attention, but you can't pay attention to something if you're not aware that it's even happening, right? So I'm very concerned about the extreme expansion and expulsion rates for Black children and poor white children across Appalachia. And I'm sharing this as downloads because I just distributed 5,000 newspapers across West Virginia. So I have a bit of a temperature right now and what people are talking about and what they're interested in, right? And I think that's one of the pieces that's been missing from Black policy. Other people have been setting the agenda for us, right? Nobody's actually been talking to us about what's going on in your community. What are you concerned about, right? I'll hear a lot of talk about how can Black farmers and Black people enter into the cannabis industry, right? Because people are starting to see medical marijuana, things like that. And we're not, do we even know how many Black farmers in Appalachia have hemp growing permits or who are actually starting to open up storefronts, right? I think I can tell you what it is in West Virginia. Don't have a fact for you, but I think it's very few. So through Black by God, I'm hoping to develop folk reporting so that I can help to empower citizens, right, to show up at community meetings with a bit of with a friend, right? Let Black by God be your friend that's showing up with you, so that we can start to download information and take notes and share information about what's going on. And I think that's the most powerful thing. Don't underestimate the power of your Facebook, the power of your Twitter, the power of your email lists to share and broker information, right? Each one teach one, right? And potency, right? I don't need 5,000 people, right, to follow me. I need 5 that will help me get engaged, or 1. So to me, this is a bit of my story, right? This is the story that I am telling you, is that I didn't know a daggone thing about lobbying or policy work until I got in there and I started lobbying as a citizen lobby. Then I became a paid lobbyist. And now I'm here today telling you that what is important, what I saw was just showing up. Listen, we're smart. We'll figure it out. You'll figure it out, right? And together we figure it out. The other thing that's really important that I've been thinking about, in addition to how do we, engage citizens to get into community meetings and to start to broker information out, is an idea that I'm thinking, maybe let's call it Afro-Appalachian futurism, right? And, folks, I love the way that Native communities think 7 generations down, right? So we're sitting here today in 2021, right? And I'm thinking about my greats, right? My grandchildren, right? They might Google me, they might find a Twitter thread, they might put together an archive about their great grandmother that lived at the turn of the century, right? And I hope when they do, they'll recognize that I've been thinking about them. And one of the things that I'm thinking about today, as I think about them in the future, is data rights. And it's a conversation that we don't talk about, because when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about roads, we're talking about, broadband, but we're not talking about the information infrastructure investment that we need to make. And we need to make that investment now in ourselves, which is what this conversation is doing and what this policy paper, everything that Bishop Marcia is doing, I believe is building an information infrastructure, right? And that's really important, because that's what our challenge is. I don't know how many ARPA meetings you have been to or community meetings, but the one thing I always come to, how do we get the word out? How do we find, it's all information. It's all about sharing information, right? So in order to build this information highway, right, we've got to start thinking about it. And one of the things that we've got to start thinking about is data rights, okay? And this is a concept where you should be paid for your data. I don't want to bore you all, but I have a not a TED Talk. I have a conversation out there with an organization called Radical Exchange, where it's called "How Much Are the Cookies in the Company Store?" And basically, it's the concept that, we understand the concept that if you mine the coal, right, you should be paid for the coal, right? But we're a little confused as citizens, right? And the fact that we're mining data and big data companies are selling our data, right? And so as we start to think about the future and information highway, data rights and data dignity is something that is these are words that are not in our everyday vocabulary, but we need to start thinking about because they impact our everyday. And I believe that Appalachia is primed for a data conversation because we do understand the power of unions and the power of people. And I'll just share one little nugget about data that might be interesting to you. You know, nobody cares about my data. Nobody cares about Shayna's data or Bishop's data or Eric's data or Melanie's data as a singular, right? But as a collective, right? That's what people care about. Big data companies, right? And that's what they sell so that they can sell us back sneakers or product ads or one of those things. But we're at a point in time where we can change that so that we can have equity in our own data. So that's something that I'm very, very interested in. I'm sharing that because I think the tech conversation and Black Appalachia's entry into tech in Appalachia is something that we are disengaged from. And not only is that sort of an opportunity for us, but it's also something that will help us engage younger generations. Okay, all right. So I want to share one more thing because I was at a talk yesterday, day before yesterday, and Dr. Nkeshe Elamine was speaking, and some of you all may know her as the co-host of Black in Appalachia. And she was breaking down the South, that everything underneath Canada was the South, and you know, it had these different geographies circled of what the South was. And she had named Appalachia way up South. And that just really tickled me and really kind of helped me, just like you were saying, Shayna, when you found your Appalachian identity, right? And how you just kind of run with that. And it's also, it really does. Being Black in Appalachia really just talks back to that identity, that white identity, right? When you claim it and you own it. And I know a lot of my family and grandmas and folks, they're like, I'm not Appalachian, I'm a mountain folks. But now that I've been preaching the gospel of Appalachia for a while, they understand it's important that we claim it. It's important that we rename it. And so I loved when Dr. Nkeshe said way up South, right? Because I think one of the things that sometimes as Black Appalachians, you know, we have to recognize that our power is networked, right? From Appalachia, right? All the way to Texas, right? And what I'm finding is a really strong community network that I'm tapping into with Black by God that is really empowering the vision of the South and including Appalachia in that conversation. And I don't think there's any other place where organizing and policy work matters most than the conversation that's happening in the South. And I'm excited that all of you here today are on that journey too. So I hope that you all will follow blackbygod.org. We've got some fire op-eds, folk reporting on there. And I think you'll learn a lot, and it's an archive that I hope to keep building. And in the interim, people that are listening, that want to get involved, I want to develop this folk reporters so that all across Appalachia, folks can attend community meetings and share their information, because witness, right? When you show up, you change the room. And when you show up, I believe, right, that you will start to see things and understand policy and be able to broker that back to your neighbor and to us in ways that, you know, 14 webinars from your local policymaker that's been doing the work can't do. Because one person told me the reason that they didn't go to watch, to witness, was because they really didn't know what to wear. And they didn't want to feel uncomfortable. And that was a question that they felt comfortable asking me, but they didn't feel comfortable raising their hand in a community room or in a Zoom room, right? So I'm bringing down the vulnerability of myself and others saying, I don't know, I don't have the answers, but I know that when I come into a room like this and when I make myself vulnerable to ask questions, what is that code? What does that mean? Then I start to learn, and then I love the collective learning, which I think is what's so important about this conversation, is that we're in it together, right? And we're starting this conversation now, which has been very lonely island for me. And so to see this organized and to see, what's happening, I truly believe, right? Just like in Rand, West Virginia, when those superstar athletes made it out, right? That we are just right here on the cusp, right, of Black policymakers in Appalachia changing the game. I truly believe that. Truly believe that. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. And as you can see, I'm wearing my 1921 shirt. This is in to honor the Tulsa riots. But what's really important as we reframe that history, that Appalachian history that's more inclusive, is that we remember that a month before the Blair Mountain battle, which I'm sure all of you all have heard of in West Virginia, was the Tulsa Massacre, right? So let me tell you about the strength and the courage of those Black men and women that organized to go up on Blair Mountain, right? A month after the Tulsa riots in West Virginia, and, and the folks that came in across, incredible courage, incredible strength. And that's a hope that what we carry in as our ancestors and our folks. They showed up on that mountain. And I'm just going to tell you, I think I'd have told my husband, nope, you're not going up that mountain with those white boys. Nope, you just sit right back down here. Don't you know what they did down there in Tulsa last month? But context is really important of history and inclusion. And I believe that we're at a moment right now where our policymakers in Appalachia are going to change the game. Thank you. My name is Crystal. I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Crystal, for all that you brought to the table. You brought in so many different layers. What I heard you speak to as far as policy making, number one, is breaking down and dismantling, that policy making is only whites only. The fact that there is this grand opportunity, and we are right here in the middle of it, to be able to bring Black voices in, not only in policy making, not only in research, but in data, in the way that we're telling the stories. I appreciate the way that you brought in poverty, which is also addressed in the report, and in the different ways that we can begin to address poverty, but also looking at the fact that, yes, it starts with Black people. It has culminated with Black people. It has been espoused by Black people, even though we didn't want to, superimposed upon us, but also the fact that it's going to take us to talk about us in order for things to be resolved. And so when you think about, and what I do appreciate about your conversation is how you brought in other things that we really don't think about or talk about. One is you have to be in our community to understand the community, the culture of the community, the need of the community, the language of the community, and how policy making can begin to shape the community in a way that the community can hold it, and also in a way that is also bringing in investment rather than divestment, because sometimes we can bring things in that's so large that the community can't handle it, and all it does is exacerbate the pain of the community. I also can appreciate the fact of how you bring in that we have to consider ourselves reporters or voices, because we have to be witness in the space, while, also realizing that in a lot of these spaces, we are marginalized. You mentioned alone, isolated, but we're marginalized. It's always just one person at the table who has to hold the space for everybody. And we have to break that marginalization that also continues to keep, us excluded, to continue to enlarge the conversations around extraction and exploitation, the various ways and how we get to do agenda setting and to become credible messengers to our own stories. And while, what I really appreciate, and I want to thank you for, is you use the word witness. I want to thank you for allowing us to witness you in your experience, to witness you in the ways that you had to learn policy making, because the truth of the matter is, a lot of times, the reasons why people don't show up at hearings or they don't do different things is simply because we don't know how to show up. Something as simple as, how do I dress for the policy occasion? How do I dress for the political conversation? Are just small ways that fears set in, and that it continues to keep us sitting down. And it's not that Black people don't want to show up. It's not that Black voices do not want to speak up and shout out and turn up the volume and unmute ourselves. What it lends to is that inside of all of these spaces of knowing and witnessing and growing in a collective space together is how we begin the conversations within our community, within our region, so that these conversations and these stories are the catalyst that takes us statewide, that takes us nationwide, that builds upon the different platforms, so that the things that this report addresses, this paper addresses, the decolonization of a narrative, the historical context and barriers that have been put in place, the lost stories, the lost voices, the lost identities, and even the ownership inside of the space that we have to take that has been lost. I loved how you put it in your paper that I'm a bill on Capitol Hill. If we just really acknowledge the fact that Black bodies has been the bills on Capitol Hill that has really taken the brunt of all of the policies, the racist policies, I say it all the time, degenerative policy making, we've taken the brunt of that. And what Black people are saying today through the Black Appalachian Coalition is that no longer do we want to be seen as the bill on Capitol Hill, that we want to push through bills that will change Capitol Hill. So I want to thank each and every one of you for that. For the sake of time, I'd like to give about 10 minutes. If anybody has any questions, we'd like to take 10 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. I don't see everyone, unfortunately. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we will make sure that that question is answered and acknowledged. If you have any comments that you'd like to make, please, by all means, feel free to do so. So we'll give it a minute just to see if anyone has any questions in the chat, or do we have any questions in the chat? Seeing none and hearing none, not seeing any raised hands, I'm going to say thank you again to all of our speakers. And what this paper, what has occurred today is, I know everyone was looking for, what is the policy recommendation? The reality is, before we can make the recommendation, we have to set ourselves up for policy making. And so what we're saying is that good policy making requires Black voices, Black stories, and the decolonization of the narrative that perpetuates racist policymaking, and the Black erasure, extraction, exploitation, and exclusion of these voices. They must be heard by legislators. The legislators must internalize these Black voices. These voices must be prioritized for inclusive representation in shaping policy and policy making. The truth of the matter is, it is going to take us coming into these spaces, bringing our stories, so that legislators are not only seeing us, witnessing us, but they're hearing us. And they're reminded, we're not giving up. We're going to show up with our stories. We're going to show up with our people power. We're going to show up in such a way that the policies that are already in place, we're going to move to shift those. And in the interim of doing that, understanding that the first part of policy making for Black people is for it to be participatory, and having legislators honor and respect the fact that it is storytelling that is required. So what are we recommending? Bringing our voices to the table, telling the stories in such a way that it advances, informs, and shifts, as well as decolonize a narrative that has carried weight far too long. This is the beginning of how we break the political lever for the investments that we need. We will bring our story so that we can have resource allocation, so that we can have investments, so that we can have good education, so that we can not only have infrastructure, but we can have that human infrastructure that we need, so that we are heard, we are seen, we are internalized, we are realized, we are informing, and we are driving and building the power that we need in all the diverse ways that we tell the story about us, by us, for the meaningful policy making that we need as Black voices in Appalachia. Thank you for that. I see your hand up, Melanie. So by all means, take a minute and then we'll begin to wrap up.
Thank you. I think that one of the things that I've taken from this is our ability to be resilient in any space that we are in. And I think that that gives us great effort to move forward. And when we look at our voices as powerful, I think that we're one of us mentioned in previous talks about the lotus or the African lily and how it comes from a muddy water. And I think that when we look at the history of Black and Brown people in Appalachia, we have to honor the fact that they haven't had anyone to remove layers. So that's why our way and methodology will look different for each and every area and space. Some places, they're told they don't have a voice, and even if you speak, we're not listening, and that still exists right now. If you go into a city council meeting right here in my hometown, you're told, hey, that's not pollution, that's steam, and if you don't like it, leave. So it's very difficult to engage people when you have leaders who are supposed to be protecting the public health and care for them, speaking to them in this way. And so I think that what Crystal bring up and what you have provided for us as a platform, Bishop, is vital, because we do have to have this space. And this still, again, for me, restores the healing and the originality of who we were as a people. We stuck together, we cared for each other, we shared in each other's experiences. And when we knew, we shared what we knew so that once we know better, we can do better. And those are things that I see as very restorative and regenerative in our possibilities. So here again, I'm just thankful for all that is brought here. And I never want to leave this space because it always feels so great and I feel so at home.
Thank you so much. Shana, you want to take a minute for some last words, and after that, Crystal, give you a minute for some closing words, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
I just want to reiterate what Melanie shared, in that it's just really good to be in this space and to have these conversations. As I've shared before in previous sessions, you could be Black and you could be Appalachian, but it took me a very long time to figure out that you could be both. So it's just really validating to be in a space where people also may have struggled with that and then have decided, hey, we can do both of those things. And I think, just coupling what Melanie and Eric and Crystal have said, it's important to bear witness. And I really appreciate the significant nature of the partnership between the Ohio Valley Regional Institute and BLAC, in that we are not necessarily conducting the research, and that's a completely different topic, but do we have Black researchers? And until we get to a point where we have Black researchers that can amplify our stories, it's important to partner with allies or like-minded individuals. So, just reiterating that this is a partnership, that we are not saying that we can't conduct the research, we're just not in the position to do that now. And the data, the stories, it's all very important, it's all very significant. So how do we get that out? Playing on what Crystal said, we have to bear witness. It's important to be present and to let people know that we are present. Even if we're not speaking at the moment, it's important to let people know that we are paying attention. So I just looking forward to whatever it is we're going to do in 2022.
Thank you for that, Shana. Crystal, I'd like to give you a minute to speak, and then, as I said, we'll.
I just love that, Shana. Whatever we're going to do in 2022, it's got a nice alliteration to it. Well, I've said a lot because that's kind of the way my mind works. But I want to share one thing, right, in this conversation that I don't think to always talk about when we talk about Black Appalachia, right? We're always sort of centering the narrative on like our how are we include. At some point, we got to talk about the way the greater Black America thinks of Black Appalachia, because I can just share real quickly that we have to do some work there in networking ourselves and our story. often Black newspapers across America, when they do run a story about West Virginia, Kentucky, it's always to highlight sort of the, you know, the KKK that marched through or the police officer that did. It's not our stories. And that's one of the things that Black by God is working with, is how can I network with other Black newspapers across so that we can tell the stories of those beautiful young Black policy makers in West Virginia that are doing the daggone thing, right? But what really highlighted this and kind of got a little burr in my craw, I'm just going to share this article here that came out in the St. Louis paper, which is a Black newspaper written by a fellow named Mike Jones, the St. Louis American. And this is an example of how I feel that so many Black leaders see Black folks in Appalachia. And that is that we're not important. And I was shocked to read this in the way that he framed Black voters in West Virginia. And these are our own people, right? And I think that we have some work to do there of making ourselves present and vibrant. I've been on several calls working on the Build Back Better. And over again, I see national Black policy leaders really advocate for Appalachia, really advocate for West Virginia, and have other leaders come in and say, no, not enough people. No, we're just going to keep it moving. And that's why I'm really excited about this, because we're going to have an organized voice that will be able to respond and be able to be a place where people like Mike Jones and people that are working on other policies see us as a collective, see us as a powerful voice, and document the rich, vibrant history of resistance that's always been here, right? And that will continue. So to me, just kind of leaving with we've talked a lot about what we can do, but I think that one of the things that we have to do is start to encourage our place and our existence, not only with the broader America, but specifically within Black press and Black organizations across America that are not thinking about, you know, the 65,000 Black folks in West Virginia. But let me tell you what, I'm putting it together now. When you see the op-eds and you see the opinion pieces that not just Black by God, but the Black folks have been putting out in resistance to Joe Manchin, right? You will see an archive of some of the most beautiful writing, some of the most historical writing, and some powerful voices that unfortunately haven't been amplified. So my name is Crystal, I'm done speaking. Thank you so much for being here, blackbygod.org. Please go follow us and reach out to me at any time if I can help anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. What we have learned today is that Black voices are experts to their traditions, their culture, and their lives, who are able to manifest the power needed to create a legacy of change that will help to shape and shift policies, not only for this generation, generations past, but for generations to come. Again, I would like to thank the Hines Foundation and the High Tides Foundation for supporting and seeding this work, for Orvie with the research support that you have given us, as well as the technical support. Our speakers for just bringing your voices to this table, for bringing your voices to this platform, for allowing people to witness you and your vulnerability, for allowing us to hear stories that begins the pathway to the change that we need, and helping us to imagine in such a broader fashion that we just can't stay compartmentalized in our thinking, because there is a broader picture out here. So I want to thank you for that, and just helping us to think through, what are we going to do in 2022? As we continue building, we ask that you join BLAC by going to our Facebook page and our Twitter page and liking and following us. You can go to the BLAC page and sign up to be engaged with us. And if you have a story, there's a Google form that I believe we can put in the link, and we ask that you share your story with us. Remember, this is the start of something big. This is an opportunity where Black voices get to preface a whole new chapter of what it means to be Black in Appalachia, not just in these 4 regions, but across all of the other Appalachian regions. And by blending and lacing together all of these voices, we get to build a story. We get to build a story for change that will demonstrate, again, as I said, we are credible messengers who get to carry our stories in so many different ways, to shift, to break, to dismantle, to unseat a narrative that has kept us behind closed doors and closed walls, that have said to us we shouldn't own who we are or where we are. And now what we're doing is saying we're taking all of that back, because to be Black in Appalachia and to be a Black Appalachian is a wonderful thing. It's a great thing. And we're bringing that greatness through our stories to help shape and inform policy making in ways that see us, hear us, validate us, and can no longer ignore us. I remember Sojourner Truth said in one of her books, even though she was talking, and I'm not self-imposing anything on anybody religiously, but I loved how she said, I'm gonna stay up in God's face until he hears me and he answers me. Well, I need you all to know that Black Appalachians is going to stay up in the face of policymakers until the change that we need becomes the change that is manifested in our lives. I want to thank you all again for joining us. I want to thank again Hines and High Tide, the High Tides Foundation, Crystal, Black by God, Shayna, Melanie, Orvie, and all of our wonderful listeners. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. And I hope that this is just the beginning and not the end of you working with the Black Appalachian Coalition as we become the change that we desire. Have a great day, everybody. But one last thing I forgot to mention. On January the 27th of next year, we will have a more in-depth discussion and presentation about this paper. The time is to be determined. On December 17th, at, I believe, 10:30, from 10:30 to noon, we will be having our Black Appalachian strategy session. Crystal, if you have not signed up, please sign up. Bring the Black policymakers that you have there, because what we're doing is building out our strategies for 2022. If you have something that you know that we need to add to this strategy moving forward, because we're not looking at just 2022 and 2024, what you heard today is we are creating a legacy, not only for our children and our children's children, but for generations to come. So again, join us, walk with us, be in step with us as we preface, create, and be the change. Now, have a great day. Talk to you all soon. Bye.